Hey Soul Surfers, welcome back to Waves of Consciousness with My Spiritual Ocean. My name is Alicia. Today we are riding the manifestation wave and we are talking about the purge. The purge.
The Purge.
Dun dun dun. Okay, it's not really that big of a deal, but we're talking about the purge. So let's go ahead and dive on in. A common question that I get asked about or hear about is, do you have to go through a purge to manifest what you want? Now, this really depends on what you define a purge to be, but ultimately the answer is yes. Some sort of purge is necessary. And before you come at me with Alicia, that's a limiting belief, hear me out. First of all, the purge only sounds terrifying, and sometimes it can feel that way, especially at first, but it's actually the key to your freedom. So, on some level, you do have to go through a purge while you're transitioning to your desired reality. Now, as I mentioned already, your definition of the purge may be different, but most commonly, when I hear people refer to a purge, they mean, do they have to remove people or things from their lives in order to get their desired reality? And the answer to that question is no. You never have to do anything you don't want to do, but let's get into why a purge on some level is actually necessary for you to manifest what you want, and more importantly, keep it. Now, when I think of a purge, I don't necessarily think of it as removing things from my life to make a change, because as we know, everything starts with self. So you can purge things from your life, but if you aren't taking care of that actual purging that needs to be done, which I'm going to talk about in more detail shortly, then you're just going to keep manifesting the same experiences in different forms. So this is why people can change where they live, they can remove people from their lives, they can do all of these external changes, but they still find themselves in repeated cycles and surrounded by the same circumstances, the same types of people, just with different faces or in a different space. And it really reminds me of that age-old expression, wherever you go, there you are. And it took me 30-something years to actually understand what that meant. The first time I ever heard that expression was from the Brady Bunch movie. Does anyone remember? Did anyone watch that? That's the first time. I don't know if, I'm sure it has been around since then, but that's where I first heard it. But I never really understood that statement because I used to say, I would be like, well, yeah, but I wasn't at the capacity to understand what that fully meant, and now I get it. So when I think of going through a purge in terms of manifestation, I think of purging your old belief systems, and that includes your old ways of thinking, your old ways of feeling, old ways of being, and old ways of doing. You simply cannot continue thinking, feeling, doing, and being the same as you always have and expect to get different results. In fact, that is the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and over, expecting a different result. And if you have been in continuous patterns in your life, you might understand that feeling of insanity, feeling like you keep doing the same things, you keep trying it over and over again, but nothing is changing. And this is where that purge comes in. Now, I do have a podcast episode. It's episode 7 of this podcast that talks specifically about belief systems, what goes into them, and how to change them for good. So if you're interested in more details on that, go check that episode out. Okay, back to what we were talking about. Now, we were talking about how you don't have to remove things from your life or make external changes in order to change your desired reality. But something I will say about this is that sometimes it can be necessary and even beneficial to remove certain people, places, and things from your life because having them around will continue to re-trigger you. And if you're not solid or knowledgeable in the skills needed to process these triggers, then you may continue to react to the person or circumstances as you always have, and that's going to keep you attached to them, and it's going to keep you in the same kinds of 3D circumstances. And this cycle of reacting and solidifying the belief and feeling that frustration or whatever you may be experiencing in terms of emotions, that doesn't allow space for things to shift, and it may leave you continuing to monitor or check your 3D circumstances to see if what you are doing is working. Now, this isn't to say you cannot reimagine or experience a different version of people, but in order to do that, you have to get yourself in line first. Because no matter how much you reimagine someone, if you don't change and address those core beliefs that you hold about yourself or the beliefs you hold about the area of life that they show up in or life in general, then you're going to just continue to have things go back to the way that they were. And this is why people find themselves in repeated cycles, in a pretty common mistake when people are manifesting a specific person. So what they do is they focus solely on changing the story of their specific person without changing the core beliefs about themselves or what is called your self-concept. And what happens here is that you become dependent on external validation. But no matter what's going on, your circumstances can only ever reflect your core beliefs. So if you reimagine somebody and they show up favorably, but you haven't changed the belief within you, such as, I'm not good enough, then that belief is going to lead to things reverting back to the way that they were. So when you get to the core of changing that belief system within, then everything else follows suit without you having to focus on trying to change the 3D to validate you. And when people find themselves focusing on reimagining their specific person, they oftentimes find themselves in a waiting stage and extremely focused on their circumstances because, again, they're waiting on that external validation when the real, what they would call work, is to validate yourself and change that core belief. Because then when everything conforms and everything happens in your reality, you're not going to doubt it or question it, or you know how to process it so it gives you this unshakable self-concept. So, and that's not to say you can't experience emotions. It's about what you do with them and about what story you revert back to after whatever has occurred has occurred. So removing people or changing your environment is not always a bad thing, and it can actually be a really powerful time for one to shift their focus to themselves, especially if there's someone who has dominantly focused on others their entire life, like I used to. You are not alone if that is you, so don't you worry. There is no shame here. We are learning about ourselves. We are seeing the conditioned programming we have. We are seeing the conditioned responses that we built up to protect ourselves. And we are de-shaming those and letting them fly free so that we can shift our story. Okay, so back to what I was talking about with focusing on other people and removing people from your life and changing your environment if you feel necessary. Now, as always, here on this podcast and in my content, there is nuance. I feel like that's my word, like the word I use the most, nuance. There's not a lot of black and white. There's some gray areas here, okay? So the nuance is that this can be easier said than done, especially for people who have insecure attachment styles. So it's always best to meet yourself where you're at and start to learn the skills necessary to support yourself, as doing too much too fast can overwhelm your system, especially if you are dominantly in a dysregulated state or a survival state. And I have more information about nervous system regulation and dysregulation in regards to manifestation. There's a podcast episode about that on this podcast. It is episode 6. So if you're interested in more detailed information about nervous system regulation and how it relates to manifestation and why it's so important, check that episode out. Let's move on to why people fear the purge. There's oftentimes a lot of fear that comes up with a lot of the things that go on during manifestation. So let's address this. Why are people afraid of the purge? That is typically because they're not really afraid of the purge. They're afraid of the uncomfortable emotions that arise as a result of making these shifts in belief systems and core beliefs about yourself. So there may also be other reasons too, but this is a big one. And the reason people are afraid of those uncomfortable emotions, again, that can range. But most people, or a lot of people, have experienced trauma or felt invalidated in their lives. And so they learn to suppress or repress those emotions instead of processing them. So they didn't have role models around that allowed them the space to process their emotions. They didn't have role models to guide them how to move through their big emotions. So that, and sometimes even when those big emotions happened, there may have been punishment involved. So, in an attempt to avoid that type of punishment or rejection, they learn to just not say anything and not allow those emotions. And that causes a whole slew of mental health issues. Okay, so that's typically what people are afraid of with the purge, the emotions that come up. It's not the actual purge. Also, I think there can be a fear of, what if this belief is actually true? What if this doesn't work? Yeah, again, survival, self-preservation tactics, this inability to process emotions or not allow ourselves to process emotions. So if you resonate, again, you are not alone. So as you become more aware of your patterns in terms of your ways of thinking and being, and you start to shift these, what happens for most people is that it brings up old uncomfortable emotions that were not processed, and these are called trapped emotions. So they're brought up so that they can be processed and released. So typically when this happens in these uncomfortable or negative emotions, as people like to call them, I try not to label them as negative because it has a negative connotation to it. I say uncomfortable because that's really the ish here. But as these come up, people think they are doing something wrong, because a lot of times in manifestation, you hear you have to feel good all the time. And the ability to feel good all the time, I do believe it's possible. But it's less about that and more about having the skills to know and trust yourself that you can get through a difficult emotion or challenging emotion or uncomfortable emotion. I try not to be judgmental, but I also like to use words that are for educational purposes and associations. So they think they're doing something wrong because these emotions are coming up. And there's this misconception that manifestation and shifting self-concepts is a straight linear line, and that's just not true. Most people go through peaks and valleys, but what happens is, as you're processing your emotions, those peaks and valleys, they become less like peaks and valleys, and they become like little rolling hills in the countryside, so you can go on a little stroll. It doesn't feel as intense. So they think they're doing something wrong when they're really not. They're just purging out the energies that are connected to the old belief systems. And these belief systems are what's stopping you or them from having their manifestation. So really, the purge is not even a bad thing. It gets a bad reputation. Poor little purge. This is why I say emotional regulation skills and nervous system regulation are so vital to sustainable manifestation, because they really help you navigate the undesirable circumstances much more easily and also help you achieve inner peace and calm, which is really an ideal state to dominantly be in to manifest what you want more quickly. And finally, something I'd like to add about the purge is that the degree to which people experience the purge varies from person to person, because it really depends on where you are at currently and where you're desiring to be, your desired reality that you want to move into. So sometimes where you're at now and your desired reality feel very far apart. So for example, I personally had a very deep abandonment wound and some deep levels of trauma that I experienced, which really negatively affected my attachment style. Maybe I shouldn't say negatively. It turned into a self-preservation mechanism and did not allow me to experience the things that I really wanted. So I had been carrying this attachment style, this insecure attachment style, for decades of my life before I even knew about how any of this stuff worked. So for me, moving from a dominantly insecure attachment style, which I, again, had been carrying the majority of my life, to a dominantly secure attachment style brought up a lot of emotions for me to process through. And this may have been different from somebody else who may have been moving from an insecure attachment style to a secure attachment style, because there's a lot of different factors that go into things. They may have brought awareness to or been given and provided this information sooner in their experience. So they caught the patterns of insecurity before they were very deeply rooted. And so they may have had less resistance when they were transitioning. There are so many factors that go into this, so it's really important not to compare your journey to somebody else's. It's very important to remember that everyone's experience is extremely individualized and unique, and it's not helpful to compare your journey to someone else's or to shame or pressure yourself to be further along than you think you should be. I don't even like the word should, because should, I heard this once and I love it. Should is someone else's belief. So if you're saying I should be doing something, that's someone else's standard, okay? That's not your standard necessarily. So another thing to think about when you are thinking about the word should, and when you start asking yourself or telling yourself, I should be doing X, Y, or Z in any context, okay? But anyway, everyone's experiences in childhood and throughout life vary greatly from one another, and they impact individuals differently. So even if someone had the exact same circumstances, they could grow into a different self-concept or develop different beliefs about themselves. It's not about the circumstances, it's about the meaning and what someone internalized from that. So those can vary greatly from person to person. So it's important to show love, compassion, and support for yourself as you grow into your desired self and grow into your desired reality. If you're looking to build the skills to navigate the purge and transform your belief systems about yourself to consistently and reliably manifest what you want, be sure to get your copy of the Ultimate Self-Concept Transformation Guide, which you can find at www.myspiritualocean.com. This guide gives you all you need to know about the process of transforming yourself so you can manifest and keep what you want in life. I also offer direct one-on-one support services such as emotion code, body code, and coaching and membership services, as well as other resources, which you can also find on my website, myspiritualocean.com. So to wrap this all up, is the purge necessary to manifest what you want? On some level, yes. But the purge does not have to be this scary, ominous thing. In fact, the purge is actually helping you to keep and sustain your manifestations. And the more you resist it, the more challenging things are going to feel for you. So change the narrative and perspective that you hold about the purge and watch how much better you feel. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining me. I will catch you on the next wave.